Will you please remain standing for the invocation as delivered by Brigadier General Kenneth Ed Brandt, Chaplain, United States Army.
And let us pray. Gracious and almighty God, some homecomings take longer than others. As a nation, we've been remiss in our response with a rally to welcome home men and women who wore the fabric of our nation. And today we say with open arms, welcome home Vietnam veterans. We're grateful for a generation who raised their hand and said, "Send me." A generation who showed up when their number was called. And a generation who responded to their nation's ask at a turbulent time in the unfolding decades of the 60s and 70s. The long, dark wall in D.C. captures the names of the fallen, a place where fingers on an engraved colleague or family member's name still emits tears in a tired and torrid moment of remembering. And today, dear God, we turn to a moment of gratitude for the gift of service to our nation by our Vietnam vets. And while the people before us may appear far from young, they remain young at heart. Their love for country is real and is attested not only by their service, but also by their courage to speak words of truth in a time where truth seems so elusive. So on this day, we say thank you. We say welcome home. And we say thank you for your service to our nation. For your name we pray, amen.
And now Senator Scott Martin will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And now the Hempfield High School Chamber Singers, under the direction of Alan Mudrick, will sing our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Beautifully done. Thank you. The Hempfield High School Chamber Singers. Please be seated. Good morning. And welcome to this ceremony honoring our Vietnam War veterans. One important thing. Have all of the veterans turned in this card? Any veterans still holding this card? Very good. You follow orders well. Would our Vietnam veterans please stand? Welcome home, brothers and sisters. I wanted to, you may be seated. I want to acknowledge our VIPs who are seated on the stage this morning, and please hold your applause until all are introduced. General William T. Hobbins, United States Air Force, retired. Brigadier General Kenneth Brandt, Chaplain, United States Army. Pennsylvania State Senators Ryan Allmett and Scott Martin. And your Pennsylvania State Representatives, Brian Cutler, Dave Hickernell, Mindy Fee, Stephen Menser, Keith Greiner, Dave Zimmerman, and Brett Miller. Thanks to our senators and representatives, this program was possible through their work. They contributed. And also joining us this morning are Bonnie Bowman, Lancaster County Recorder of Deeds and Director of the Thank a Vet program. If you don't have your Thank a Vet card, I would urge you to get it. See Bonnie, and she will make sure you get your card. It costs you nothing. It takes a matter of minutes to sign up for it, but you can get rewards and discounts at a number of restaurants and stores throughout Lancaster County. It's well worth having. I have mine in my wallet, and I use it. You save money, veterans. Also, Daniel Tooth, Director of the Lancaster County Veterans Affairs. Now, both have tables set up out in the lobby and will be happy to answer any questions you have regarding veterans programs and benefits. And the committee thanks the Hempfield High School School District for allowing us to use their facility, this beautiful facility. And the Performing Arts Center Director, Greg Byerly, back there at the controls, who has been tremendous in making us feel welcome, and his can and will do attitude when it came to some of our many requests. He never said no. And also Greg's right-hand man back there, Michael Strange, Jr. at Hempfield High School. Thank you both for your support. And the young people that you see wearing the Air Force blue, my favorite color, are serving as ushers. They are members of the J.P. McCaskey High School Junior ROTC program. And they also provided the Vietnam War 50th anniversary commemorative flag you see on the stage over there. They are under the command of Colonel Ed Hurston, United States Air Force, retired. And a thank you goes out to Lidditz Springs veterans of foreign wars post-1463 for providing the POW MIA flag. And a huge thank you to Melissa Hershey, Director of the Republican Caucus Services for the Pennsylvania State Senate. Melissa was the coordinator of this morning's program, and she put it all together and made it all happen. And believe me, these things don't happen overnight. There is a tremendous behind-the-scenes work that goes on in making something such as this possible. So where is Melissa? Melissa's over there, back there. Melissa, thank you so much on behalf of the veterans. And I now call on State Senator Ryan Aument of the 36th District. Captain Aument served in the United States Army during the Iraq War. His decorations and awards include the Bronze Star Medal. Senator, or if we might prefer this morning, Captain Aument.
I do. Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, welcome home, and welcome to this ceremony honoring our Vietnam veterans. It's a real privilege for our Lancaster County Legislative Delegation, House and Senate delegation to host this event this morning, to recognize you, to thank you, to welcome you home, to thank your families for your service and the sacrifices that you have made, not just during your military service, but I know many of you in this room have been active members of your communities and have served Lancaster County in the many years since your military service, and thank you for that also. I also wanted to acknowledge our full legislative staff that worked with Melissa to pull this event together. We have the opportunity here to sit on stage and to speak. They prefer to operate in the shadows, but as such, they often don't get the chance to be recognized for the work that they have put into bringing this event. So if you are a member of any of our legislative staffs, if you would please, many of them are standing in the back now and they just started to hide. But if you'd be willing to sort of step forward and if we could thank them. They were very clear to me, knowing I guess my reputation, I only have 2 or 3 minutes with you, so I'll be very brief. I think these events are phenomenally important, not just to recognize your generation and to provide this long overdue welcome, this long overdue recognition, but as our country today, I was just looking at statistics this morning, less than 1%, about 0.4% of our 325 million citizens, fellow citizens, are serving in the armed forces today. And about 7% have some connection, either serving with the United States military or serving as veterans. Around the time that you were serving, that number was closer to 14%. And so we have fewer and fewer of our fellow citizens who have served, fewer and fewer of our citizens who have some connection to military service. And I do think there is a consequence to that. In 1975, about 70%, better than 70% of the members of Congress had served in our military. Today, that number is about 20%. Again, I think there are consequences to that when we look at public policy and those that are making decisions regarding our young men and women serving overseas. And so I think these events are phenomenally important, not only to recognize your service, but to serve as a reminder to our fellow citizens so that I can talk to my 7-year-old son this morning why Daddy's going to work on a Saturday morning, and I can have a conversation with him about our men and women who've served our country and have sacrificed so much for us. It's an important conversation for us to have. Finally, on a personal note, when I returned home from Iraq the end of 2003, early 2004, it was Vietnam veterans in my community that were the very first, among the very first, to welcome me home. And so, as a veteran of the war in Iraq, and on behalf of my fellow soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, thank you. I think there's a special bond between those who've served our country in Vietnam and those who served our country in Iraq and Afghanistan. Your generation was determined, was absolutely determined to ensuring those who served with me in Iraq and those who served in Afghanistan received the welcome home that you did not receive. And I thank you for that. On a personal note, may God bless you.
Thank you, Ryan. And just to touch on what Ryan said about veterans welcoming troops home, it was the Vietnam-era veterans who first showed up at the airports to welcome home the troops from Operation Desert Storm. And that was started by the Vietnam Veterans of America, of which I am a proud member. The Vietnam Veterans of America adopted the motto, "Never again will one generation of veterans abandon another." And now I would like to call on Pennsylvania State Representative Brian Cutler of the 100th District with some remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Hawksworth, for being here and helping with this event. I'm going to thank all the veterans, your friends, and your family for being here as well. Earlier this summer, I had the distinct privilege of taking my children down to Washington, D.C., and it was late in the evening as we were making our rounds around the monuments. And as we came to the monument for the Korean and the Vietnam Wars, I was able to explain to my kids, much like Senator Ahmet was explaining, about the wars, about the sacrifices, and what happened. And it was particularly touching at the Vietnam Memorial because there was a disabled veteran there sharing his story that night. And my kids were able to hear about the direct personal impact, something that I was able to help somewhat with while I was in law school. I worked in our Veterans Law Clinic, and overwhelmingly the individuals that we worked with in that clinic were Vietnam veterans who had come home, and they were looking for assistance through the VA. And one of the things that frustrated me was sometimes the lack of attention that the veterans were able to get through the services. And we've seen the news stories, and I know that you perhaps have friends. And we work diligently to ensure that not just that you were welcomed home, but that you were rightfully thanked for everything that you have done and everything that you have earned. Many of you stepped forward with nothing in your mind in terms of what you wanted. It wasn't anything beyond the love of country and the desire to serve. And since we were able to go and share that here with you this morning, I want to thank you on behalf of the House delegation. And we want to express how deeply honored we are that we get to recognize your service, we get to recognize welcoming you home, and we get to thank you for your involvement, not just with our country, but our local communities once you returned. Thank you for everything that you do, and we look forward to honoring you later this morning.
In what has been viewed by many as actions long overdue, the 2008 National Defense Act authorized the Secretary of Defense to conduct activities to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. In an effort to reach as many veterans as possible, the Secretary is coordinating efforts with both military and non-military organizations and supporting programs and activities of the federal, state, and local governments. The commemorative program includes ceremonies such as the one this morning, designed to fulfill the objective, which is to thank and honor veterans of the Vietnam War, including those who were held as prisoners of war or listed as missing in action. It is designed to honor Vietnam War veterans for their service and sacrifice on behalf of the United States of America. Special recognition is also paid to the families of these veterans, for they too sacrificed. This commemoration includes all 9 million United States veterans who served from 1 October 1955 to 15 May 1975 and their families. And while we acknowledge the distinction between veterans who served in country, in theater, and who were stationed elsewhere during this period, today we honor all who served. As stipulated by the National Defense Act of 2008, all who served during the Vietnam War are now known as Vietnam War veterans. According to the most recent count, nearly 2 million Vietnam-era veterans are no longer living. And so let us pause for a moment of silence to remember our fellow veterans, brothers and sisters, who are no longer with us. Thank you. Now I draw your attention to the screen. To recognize official ceremonies and activities, a commemorative seal was created. Each element of the seal bears some significance. Every detail is outlined in your program, but I would like to point out a few and share their significance. A representation of the Vietnam Service Medal, the ribbon, rests below the inner rings of the seal. The red, white, and blue inner rings represent the flag of the United States of America and recognize all Americans, both military and civilian, who served or contributed to the Vietnam War effort. The outer black ring serves as a reminder of the killed in action, prisoners of war, and missing in action. Within the blue ring are the words sacrifice, valor, and service, valor, and sacrifice, virtues demonstrated by our veterans. The blue star at the bottom of the inner blue ring represents the families of all veterans and symbolizes their support from home. 6 white stars symbolize the United States and its allies during the Vietnam War: Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Republic of Korea, and Thailand. The black outline of the map of the country of Vietnam signifies the Vietnamese people who stood with our troops. The white 50th emblazoned over the map and the outer and inner gold rings, which make traditional use of the color to signify the 50th anniversary, symbolize the mission of the Department of Defense program as outlined by Congress to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. The green laurel wreath signifies honor for all who served. The Defense Department Vietnam War commemoration and this ceremony today renews America's commitment to you, the Vietnam veteran, who answered your country's call to service. You stepped forward when some others didn't. You stood to be counted. You served with honor, with dignity, and then you came home. And a grateful nation honors and thanks you for your dedicated and unselfish service to our country in time of conflict, in time of war. In wearing your Vietnam War commemorative pin, do so in honor, in knowing that you earned it with your personal and unselfish sacrifice to your country. On the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in our nation's capital, that long black granite wall, are the names of 58,307 young Americans who will forever remain young. Many of us in this auditorium this morning can put faces to names on that wall. And so let us wear our pin in honor and remembrance of someone we once knew and in our hearts is still with us. And also, let us wear our pin in remembrance of the 1,006 Americans still listed as missing in action in the Vietnam War. On the back of your pin, you will find these words: "A grateful nation thanks and honors you." Also, the official name of the commemoration is included to remind each veteran that this is a national initiative, and the lapel pin is the nation's lasting memento of a thank you for your service well done. And now, fellow veterans, and other guests, I have the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker, General William T. Hobbins, United States Air Force retired. In your program, you will find General Hobbins' biography, highlighting his outstanding career in service to our country. It is an impressive service record. Will you please welcome General William Tom Hobbins.
Thank you. Now, I would like to thank the members of the commemorative partner organization, specifically the Lancaster delegation of the PA General Assembly, for the event today and the honor to be your keynote speaker. The fact that we have so many distinguished local and state representatives here tells you just how important this event is to them. Now, I want to throw a special welcome out because I know I have a lot of Air Force family in this audience, but here in the front row is my wingman for life, Robin, my spouse. I have my command chief, Gary Coleman, who was my command chief in Europe. His wife, Senior Master Sergeant retired Harry Coleman, Colonel retired Gina Giles, Colonel Sandra Alford, and they traveled from South Carolina, Maryland, and D.C. to be here. So thank you for doing that especially for me. Now, just let me add to that humbling introduction. I graduated from college in 1969 and was actually drafted in my senior year. However, I was pilot qualified, and there was a demand for pilots because the Vietnam War was on, so I went to officer training school for the Air Force in 1970, graduated in pilot training in 71. I was in the class of 85 officer training school candidates when the draft was suspended for the lottery system. They told us we could leave our enlistment right away because if your number was above 100, your birthday that was drawn was above 100, there was no chance you were going to get drafted. So my number was 256. Half the class left and returned home. I decided I really wanted to stay, fly fighter aircraft, serve as my father and my grandfather did. So I served in Southeast Asia during this Vietnam Veterans Recognition period, but I was not in Vietnam. From 71 to 73, I actually taught South Vietnamese Air Force pilots how to fly their main fighter, the AT-28. Then in 1974, I was asked to continue that role in Thailand, training the air forces of other nations, Laos and Cambodia, that were under the similar threat of communist expansion. Now, as we look back on time, it's well known that the Vietnam-era vets returning home throughout the war were not well received. It was an unpopular war that can be remembered as not having clear, achievable objectives. However, we all were very proud that we helped the people of South Vietnam, who didn't want to be part of a communist party. I remember when we came home, not as today's active duty veterans do, hearing, "Thank you for your service," but as those who had little to no support for the sacrifices they or their families made. Some Vietnam vets were actually spit on at airports, a far cry from the hero welcome our troops returning from the war today get. Now, so as I looked over the commemorative program objectives, I felt compelled to speak about some of the unrecognized benefits that came out of the Vietnam War. And I want to highlight the advances in technology, science, and medicine related to the Vietnam War and the subsequent military research experiences that were adopted following the Vietnam War. And let me call these unexpected benefits that serve both our living veterans and the civilian community and those serving today and tomorrow. And let me hasten to add, because I see a lot in the crowd today, the role the families play in today's war has also seen benefits literally derived from the Vietnam War experience. In essence, these positive outcomes, whose Vietnam War origin might not be recognized, I want to call attention to. Now, before I go on, I must talk to the symbol that means the most to our Vietnam veterans today, and that's the Vietnam Memorial in D.C. This wall has clearly helped to begin the healing. So many families who lost loved ones to see them honored this way feel good. And when I say that, I'm including the veterans and their families who did come home. You know, there are 58,307 names now listed on that polished black wall. The names are arranged in the order which they were taken from us, by date. And within each date, the names are alphabetized. It's hard to believe it was 61 years ago when we lost the first casualty, in June 8th of 1956. And sadly, his name is on the wall with that of his son, a Marine Lance Corporal, who died 11 years later in 1965. You know, there are 3 sets of fathers and sons on the wall. 39,996 on the wall were just 22 or younger. 8,283 were just 19 years old. The largest age group, 33,103, were 18 years old. 12 soldiers on the wall were 17 years old. 5 soldiers on the wall were 16 years old, and 1 soldier was 15 years old. Almost 1,000 soldiers were killed on the first day in Vietnam, and 1,448 soldiers were killed on the last day in Vietnam. There were 31 sets of brothers. There are 31 sets of parents who lost 2 sons. 54 soldiers attended Thomas Edison High School in Philadelphia. And 8 women's names are on the wall, lost while nursing the wounded. One last point, 244 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. 153 of them are on the wall. Now, to those of us who survived the war and to the families of those who did not, we see the faces, we feel the pain, and we want to remember. We are, until we too pass away, haunted by the very personal losses, because they were our friends, our fathers, our sons, our daughters, and even grandparents. I personally believe the Vietnam War made the nation further demand dedication to recovering POWs and MIAs, and once again renewed our commitment that they will never be forgotten or left behind. Efforts to bring POWs and MIAs and their remains home are continuously underway. The experience we had in Vietnam has made that recovery an unyielding principle of honor to bring home all the POWs and account for all. I'll offer this example. In 1973, there were 2,646 Americans unaccounted for. And by August of this year, there were 1,604 Americans unaccounted for. We have learned much from the Vietnam experience. It may pale in comparison as I draw this, but the wars between 1991 and 2008 timeframe, where we had 14 missing in action from Iraq-Afghanistan war, and of those, 1 was returned, 7 were rescued by the Marines, and the remains of 4 were returned, and only 1 remains unaccounted for. Now, another aspect of the Vietnam War that I believe offers benefits to our forces today is our highly successful medical advances and wounding and critical trauma care, where what we learned from the Vietnam vets was absolutely critical. The war in Vietnam provided wound care and life-saving lessons that are helping our service heroes survive today. Our civilian medical advances are direct benefactors of what we learned in the combat casualties in Vietnam. In fact, in the Vietnam War, the surgeon veterans would tell you as they came back from that war, they were better trained than when they went through the schools and hospitals that trained them. Our Vietnam experience helped us understand that what we call the golden hour now in Afghanistan and Iraq wars. This is where the first hour immediately after being wounded is recognized as the most vital for saving our wounded warriors. If you can get the warfighter to medical care in the first hour, their chances of survival increase exponentially. The principle has now been adopted by paramedics in hospitals across the world. Now, surgical glue you can Google it. The inventor of super glue, also known as crazy glue, delivered it to the U.S. as a surgical glue to close wounds, and since then its technology has saved thousands. Today, we also credit what we learned in Vietnam with helping us lower the time from injury on the Middle East battlefield to takeoff in Germany, and the answer to that is 28 hours. These patients are flown to the U.S. by other critical care airborne trauma teams, usually within days of arrival in Germany. In comparison, the time from injury in Vietnam to the arrival in the U.S. was 45 days. Wounded warriors now have a 98% survival rate and are returned to the U.S. in 3 days or less. During Desert Storm, their survivability rate was 75%. It took 10 days to move wounded patients to the U.S. So I will tell you that the improvement in the combat case fatality rate from the war in Vietnam to recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan equates to the lives of roughly 8,000 military personnel being saved. In other words, if the combat case fatality rate during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan remained as it was in Vietnam, it would have projected 13,378 U.S. military personnel would not have lost their lives. Instead, we lost over 5,000 as a result of the combat in these recent wars. PSTD, post-traumatic stress disorder, previously called shell shock, is now recognized condition, and treatments now follow the veteran until they are resolved. We can help them identify these problems earlier, encourage them to seek care, destigmatize that care, and make services more affordable and accessible, including remote technologies like telemedicine and telemental health. Perhaps more important is doing everything possible to help veterans protect the two main sources of social support, and that's their families and those that serve them alongside. Those two groups are more important to recovery, and we can thank the Fisher houses now that near every medical facility were built to support families of wounded warriors. Now, it's important to recognize that programs for family support today are an outgrowth of the Vietnam War. In those days, many of the spouses watched in the neighborhoods looking for the chaplains arriving at another home, knowing there would be bad news. So they banded together. Then, and their early commitment and dedication to families resulted in reintegration programs, in counseling and bereavement programs that follow families for years after they return. Families know a lot more about the services of post-traumatic stress victims. There are deployed spouse groups to support programs to educate children of deploying members to know what they live like overseas. Families are much better prepared today than they were during the Vietnam War. Now, here are a few good outcomes that I'll just briefly mention. The Vietnam War brought strong condemnation of biological weapons, now banned. Helicopter warfare, introduced in Vietnam to fly in and fly out soldiers, has made warfare more tactical and precise and has reduced loss of life in battle, all from lessons learned in Vietnam. Many believe we may not have seen a halt in the communist aggression in Southeast Asia if it had not been for the Allied support to South Vietnam. The Vietnam War dramatically slowed down and certainly gave pause to other nations' military aggression and occupation. As I mentioned earlier, we have an all-volunteer force. The draft is gone, changed near the end of the Vietnam War. Today's military is in harm's way because they volunteered to be there. When we think of our vets, we understand the commitment that comes with signing a blank check to the American people, payable with your life. They deserve the respect and gratitude of this nation because of you, all the veterans who not only changed the face of the battlefield with better weaponry, tactics, protective gear, immediate medical care, technological advance, you changed the course of wounded veterans' lives and enabled family support in a much better way. We fought to ensure our future veterans have lifelong educational benefits for them and their families, care for the injuries, care for the families. The VA home loan program has improved. The VA had to grow. Disability benefits were better identified. Today, are serving our returning vets in better ways in providing guaranteed home loans for families who lost their loved ones. We can all of us claim, to be a big part of opening the doors of the modernization of the VA system. Vietnam veterans should feel good about the successes we made possible, your service, the advances made in medicine, from your sacrifices to family adaptions we learned from our family experiences, and the proud heritage of the Vietnam veterans displayed every year has made the country care about the military returnees. Thank you. So while we sadly remember the Vietnam War, and the way many in America treated you, we must always remember the sacrifices of those listed on that polished black marble wall. To those of us who survived the war, and to the families of those who did not, I encourage you to remember those sacrifices in the context of how the value of these unexpected yet positive outcomes benefit our service brethren today. I would like each of you here today, for what is certainly a noble event, to thank the Vietnam veterans and join with me this day in honoring them. They deserve our thanks for the sacrifices they and their families made. Today and through this commemorative period ending in Memorial Day in 2025, let's honor our veterans, remembering that they served to ensure freedom's future and certainly left their legacy for future veterans and their families, ultimately putting them in a better place. You inspired our present and future veterans with your love of country. History will remember us best for our dedication to service, to nation, and the well-being of others, and will hopefully always be welcoming our noble military veterans home as heroes, whether they return carrying a flag or are wrapped in one. Thank you.
Thank you, General. When I heard that General Hobbins was going to be our speaker, I knew that we were in store for some good words. I had heard him speak in the past, and it was an honor to have him join us this morning. Thank you again, General. And now, my fellow Vietnam veterans, it is time for you to receive your Vietnam War commemorative pin. So when your name is called and you are physically able, please stand to receive your pin. I beg your forgiveness if I mispronounce your name. Believe me, it is not intentional. I will do my best. But I'm going to be honest with you. Some of these names are a little tricky. I'll start with an easy one. John Dickey Jr., David Bicking, Joseph Follinger, Ken Asper, Gary M. Greiner, Jan Gerhardt, David Sanchez, Charles Rittenhouse, David Damron, David W. Datesman. Walter Konicki, Ronald Wenger, James Dosh, Daniel Pierce, Ronald E. Vogel, Robert Boyd, Roger Hipple, Jay Stiegelman, Mark Forth, John Snyder, James Anderson, Neil Wolford, Dean Stoltz, M. Wayne Peters, Glenn A. Williams. Leroy Lehman, Michael Wickenheiser, David Stoltz, Mary Rost, Stephen Paulin. Jack Lockoff, Kenneth Panetta, Delmar Lutz Jr., Charles Rost, Larry Miller. George Ray, Robert Hershock, Robert J. Martin, Robert Kemp, Kenneth Myers. Woody Sampson, Edward Krimmel, Douglas Kelly, Kenneth Hamill, Paul Hurdle. James Bletcher, Craig Kaufman, Walter King, James Montgomery, Samuel Crowell. Clyde Bleacher, David Greenwood, Thomas Miller, Richard Schneider, Gerald Fisher. Clifford Shank, Michael Hoffman, William E. Andrews, Jr., Gerald Kinnear, or Nair Kinnear, James L. Adams. David Dreibelbis, James Reed, David Yutz, Paul Bischofberger, Robert Seacrest, David Dreibelis, Michael Andres, Ted Moore, Paul Barringer, Howard Kramer, John Huber, Stephen Hughes, Bruce Donaldson, Leslie Eller, C. David Kramer, Kenneth Martin, Tom Bonelli, Barry Whitcraft, Edward Bookman, Dan Helm, Patrick Rundle, Tom Bonelli, Leslie Shelley, David Snavely, James Wentz, Daniel Bostic, Kathleen Russell. Paul Costello, Nevin May, Craig Benage, John Filowitz, in honor of Thomas Bicking, Daniel Brown, David L. Walls, Bill Warner, Thomas Newby, in honor of Walter Greenewald. Jeff Pokapek, John McLaughlin, Clayton Thomas, Frank Judd, Donald Gregory Martin. In case you have been wondering why at times I would say in honor of, that's in honor of a veteran who is no longer with us and a loved one is accepting his or her commemorative pin. Richard Schlincher, Gary Fischbach, P. Craig Lenhard, Philip Donnelly, Frederick Kner, or Ner. Thomas Conselman, Carl Metzinger, John Matthias, Alan Hilbert. Robert Groff, Yi Ka, John Dobish, Jeffrey Brightbill. Charles Deutsch, William Klein, Jesse Epps, James Reaver, Robert Kramer, Dennis Wechter, Fred Schultz, Ed Fox. David Shelton, in honor of Timothy Schober, Fred Milhouse, Wayne Deem, John Jenkins, James Buckner, Dale M. Austin, Paul Keller. Lonnie Logan, Donald Nislanik, Sheldon Muir, Peter J. Luciani, Grover G. DeVault, Thomas Kirshner, James Lindberg, Roger Malott, Darrell L. Gerke, Lyle Rader, Richard Pedin, David Brensinger. Robert DeVosa, Donald Galbraith, Thomas Alexander, Carrie Fritz. Dan Harrelson, Roy Jones, Ernest Lehman, Richard Hess. Ruben Stolzfus, Ronald Freiberger, James Tribble, John Gergel, Gregory Bretz, Howard Freiberger, Warren Kimmel, Arthur Cassatt, Daniel Marshall, Michael Mazzaro, Robert Smith, Larry Kaufman, Bruce Deisinger, Kenneth Brenneman, Michael Miller, Mike Kunitsky, Michael Heisey. Charles Groff, Ronald L. Horn Sr., Van Lundgren, Lee Kendall, Jeffrey Hornberger, John Hildebrand, Nevin Stauffer, William Weidman, Earl Klein, Jr., Kenneth Betts, Paul Rainier, Bob Rapp, Brian Long, Ed Lloyd, Alan Lead, William Lechner, Robert Miller, George Teralotsky, Charles Thompson, all right. This is the most challenging one of the morning. And again, my humbling apologies. I'm going to give it my best shot. Marcian Your teachers must have had fun with this one. Spigliozzi. Yes, Marcian Spigliozzi, yes. Yes. How did your drill instructor handle that? John Gantz, in honor of Raymond Hall. Fred Flosser. Michael Volz. Robert Beatty, or Beatty. Richard Beatty. Richard Lewis. David Allen. David Kleinfelder.
It's all one section left.
Okay. Jim Culp. Richard Brown. Dwayne Heist. Peter Byrne. Greg Fiola. Jeffrey McCoy. Marshall Hess. Larry Bingaman. Ralph F. Horn. Francis Zimmer. William H. Schleiner, Jr. Charles Snyder, Jr. James Haug. James Mumo. Jeffrey Schoaf. Gerald Reuter. Jim Culp.
I think you went through all of them. General will be coming up.
Okay. Is there any veteran who did not get a pin? Lonnie Burke? Burker. Lonnie Burker. Lonnie Burker. Ricky Peden.
I need the mic just for a second. Richard Hawksworth, an Air Force veteran.
Thank you, General. Wear your pins proudly. You earned them. It has been an honor to serve as your MC for this program. No other war, with the exception of the Civil War, so divided this great country of ours. The healing process took a long time, and for some of our fellow veterans, the struggle continues. But let me leave you with this story of a fellow Vietnam War veteran. And some of you, like I, have had the privilege of knowing this Vietnam War veteran. His name was Ed Davis, Captain Ed Davis. Died November 7th of 2006. He was 67 years old. But let's go back to 1965, when Ed Davis was 25 years old. A U.S. Navy pilot. He was shot down on his 57th combat mission over North Vietnam. He was captured and held prisoner of war for 7.5 years. 1 year in captivity, or rather solitary confinement. But think of that, 7.5 years as a prisoner of war. He was held at the infamous Hanoi Hilton, along with John McCain and Jeremiah Denton. The treatment, the torture, was brutal, unspeakable. Ed was in the first group of POWs to be set free on February 12, 1973. The prisoners of war were released on their terms. First down, the wounded, the sick, first out. Ed stayed in the military, and I must say that just a matter of days after Ed's release from captivity, I had the honor of interviewing Ed. Ed and other Navy and Marine POWs were taken to the Bethesda Naval Hospital outside of Washington. And a meeting was set up with the media. And the POWs were asked if they would talk with some of the reporters. Some did, and some understandably did not. When Ed found out that I was from WGAL, he said, "Sure, I'll talk with him." Ed had married a Lancaster County girl before leaving for Vietnam, so he recognized WGAL. And also, when I told him that I had served, I think that helped open the door. We had a short interview. I knew the questions not to ask. Don't talk about the torture. It wasn't the time. So we talked about mundane things like sports and food what he missed. It was a short interview, given the condition of the POWs, but Ed stood tall. And as we were packing up, my photographer and I, Ed said, "Let's stay in touch." Now, I didn't think much of it at the time, but we did. That summer, he called me at the news desk and said he was at his in-laws in Leola, and why don't you come on out and I'll talk some more. So I did another interview, again staying away from the horrors he endured. I could tell he wasn't ready to talk. And Edward, when he retired from the Navy, he settled in Millersville, and our friendship grew stronger. And as Jeremiah Denton and other POWs told their stories by writing books, when Ed and I would get together, I would say, "When are you going to let me tell your story?" Because Ed never spoke publicly about his time in captivity. And he'd always look at me with that twinkle in his eye and that Ed Davis smile and say, "When the time is right, Dick, when the time is right." That time came in 1998, on the 25th anniversary of his release from captivity. I was in the newsroom that morning in late January, got a phone call, and as he always did, greeting me with, "Ed Davis here." I said, "How you doing, brother?" And what I had done from the first time I met Ed and stayed in contact with him was every February 12th, I would call him and simply say, "Welcome home, brother." That's how we cemented our friendship. Anyway, Ed asked me, "Do you know what's coming up next month?" I looked at my calendar and I saw February. I said, "Yeah, 25th anniversary of your release." He said, "I think it's time to talk." So I went to his home in Millersville with my photographer. We sat on his couch. I had no notes, just two veterans of the same war, certainly under different conditions. And we talked. We had a conversation. And Ed opened up. He talked about things he had never talked about in 25 years. And he told me of the tortures. He told me of the treatment. And he told me how he was able to stay strong, even in the most difficult of times. Throughout those 2 hours, he never lost his composure, always in command of his emotions, always in command of his self. And I could see how this man could withstand 7.5 years of hell. This man was so strong. But the final question got to him. I asked him how he felt the very first time he saw the American flag as a free again American. And for the very first time during those 2 hours, this man of strong composure, this man always in control, became emotional. His eyes became moist. He bowed his head. And he looked at me and he said, "When I saw the American flag for the first time, I knew it was all worth it." We served with some mighty fine people. And now will you please rise as Chaplain Brandt delivers the benediction and remain standing for the retiring of the colors.
Let us pray. Gracious God, give us the courage to look back and not stare, to go back but not stay, to forgive and not always forget, to allow the past to shape a promising future as we give thanks for service, valor, and sacrifice that we find in the souls of men and women who served. Amen.
And salute. And that concludes our program. My fellow veterans, thank you again for your service. Wear your pins with pride. Stay well, my friends.